Welcome, everybody, to today's session on motor development as it relates to completing the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel. So just a reminder on the terminology that we use. Seem to have skipped a couple of pages. On the terminology that we use in this space, we're using affirming language and identity-first language. Affirming language means using language that follows the social model of disability, which centers lived experience over medical deficit framing. And identity-first language means using language that frames neurodivergence as a difference, not a disorder. It means focusing on the identity instead of pathology. So, for example, we would say autistic and not has autism. It's the difference, I very often say, of using it as an adjective, as a descriptor, instead of as a noun, which is another thing separate from yourself. The term neurodevelopment refers to the brain's development and its systems and networks, and everybody has an individual neurodevelopment path that they follow. This includes our ability to learn, how we read, our social skills, memory, attention skills, all of those things. A neurotype is a person's unique way of thinking, learning, and communicating, which is determined by the way that their brain has processed information. Neurotypical refers to the predominant neurotype or neuronormative neurotype, and this is when a person thinks and processes information and behaves in a way that is typical or expected within their culture. And so basically this means our culture is a neurotypical centered culture. So everything that is the way our systems and everything are set up to meet the needs of a neurotypical neurotype. A neurodivergent person is a person whose brain develops and functions in a way that results in them thinking and behaving differently to societal expectations. So this may be differences in social preferences, ways of learning, ways of communicating, or ways of perceiving an environment or sensing an environment. The neurodivergent umbrella there lists some of the many different conditions or experiences that come under being neurodivergent. And neurodiversity is a group of people with mixed neurotypes, and this includes neurotypical people. So very importantly, neurodivergent and neurodiversity are not interchangeable. Neurodiversity means that there is a mix of all types of different types of neurotypes. Neurodivergent means different from neurotypical. And also important to note that the majority of neurodivergent people are multiply neurodivergent, so they will experience more than one neurodivergence, and this will impact the way that they learn and process and experience the world. Just to clarify further the neurodiversity thing, neurodiversity, if we imagine that as vanilla, a vanilla cupcake, and neurodivergent are all the other different types of cupcakes. So there are obviously lots of more different types of cupcakes than just vanilla. A neurodiverse group is a mix of those cupcakes, and that includes vanilla in that mix. But a group of any one type of neurotype is not neurodiversity. So if it was an entire group of chocolate cupcakes, although it would not be neurotypical, it would also not be neurodiverse. These are the areas of neurodevelopment that we talk about within the profile wheel, and you can see a link there for the profile wheel overview discussion that was held in November with myself and Lori Morrison, going over generally how to use the framework of this tool in order to best support the needs of young people. The areas that we've covered already are cognitive, sensory, emotional, and communication. Today we're doing motor. Next week is social. Also in reference to the neurodevelopmental profile wheel, this is generally what the wheel looks like without the form that comes with it. And it's important to understand that each of these areas are equally impactful and important in terms of a young person's experience of their world. We're using this tool in order to gather the observable evidence, the external behavior, what we can see of a child's internal experience, because a lot of the time we know a young person isn't able to express what their internal experience is. So we're just having to try to guess based on what we can see of how they're interacting with the world and with us. So we collect this information to guide us in identifying those unmet needs that are driving the observable distress or difficult behavior, as it's often described. So this wheel shows that 6 areas of neurodevelopment that make up a person's internal experience. It's every person on this planet, but we're using this in terms of trying to understand how a neurodivergent person is experiencing the world, because for the most part, young people have difficulty in different areas of their life when they're not neurotypical, because as I said before, the world is set up to support the needs of neurotypical people. So if they likely have a neurodevelopmental difference, this will be demonstrated in kind of the way that they're interacting with the world. It's important to note, though, that this is not a part of the NDOS assessment, and completing this form has nothing to do with NDOS paperwork or NDOS assessment. This is about us trying to capture what we can see and then look at all of that evidence together like an investigator, trying to figure out the clues, and then working out what supports we can put in place in order to help the young person better engage with their life and their world now. That image there from NeuroWild, I think, expresses that graphically very perfectly, that we're seeing what is above the ground, but there's all of this stuff that is leading to how that person is growing and how they're experiencing the world and why they're coming out the way they are, basically. Also at the center of the profile wheel is the My World Triangle, and that's because the My World Triangle is the main tool of GERFEC, Getting It Right for Every Child, to remind us that we're looking at strengths and challenges in all parts of a child's life, because this isn't something that should be done for at home or at school. This is about the fullness of that young person's experience, and that means that this profile wheel, this tool, should be used collaboratively. It's a team activity that all of the young people's adults that are around them, all of the people who are caring for them, should be doing this activity together. And very importantly, we want to be capturing the child's views in whatever way is appropriate for them. So if they can verbalize that, if they can write that out, if they can draw a picture, we need to center in this discussion the child's voice and their needs and their wants. Okay, so on to motor development. You'll likely all have a general idea of motor development skills because we all use them every day. And so they kind of come up a lot in general discourse. But to be a little scientific about it, motor skills are tasks that require voluntary control over movements of the joints and body segments in order to achieve a goal. And motor control is defined as the process of initiating, directing, and grading purposeful voluntary movement. So being able to decide what you want to do, like assess the situation, decide what you want to do, and then make your body do it in a way that is appropriate to that task. So how much pressure you put on and all of those things. Gross motor skills are the bigger movements like running and jumping, and fine motor skills are smaller movements like handwriting, doing up buttons, and even using your lips and your tongue for eating and drinking and speaking. Oh, there's a typo. Please forgive me. So gross motor skills involve those large muscle groups, like I said, like arms, legs, and torso. And most everyday activities are included in our gross motor skills. So being able to sit, walk, stand, twist, bend, and hand-eye coordination is included in gross motor skills. Fine motor skills, as I said, include speaking, the use of muscles in the mouth, jaw, tongue, and cheeks, and lips to produce speech. And your ability to do that will depend on the strength, coordination, and endurance of these muscles. Your hand and finger strength, your hand control, being able to manipulate and control objects, coordination, getting your body and brain to move together, tactile perception, knowing what's being touched, bilateral coordination, both sides of the body being used together. So, so it doesn't look, so that one side of your body isn't doing all of the work. And dexterity, which is your precision and your control. So what do we need to move? We need to want to move more than anything, and we need to have the strength to move and the knowledge of how to move. So here this list shows us all of the things that kind of go into one movement. And as you can see, that's a lot of different things. And so if the young person that you're completing a profile wheel for is demonstrating difficulty with movement, there are a lot of different aspects of that need to be looked at and investigated. So motivation, the desire or the need, you also need to have the right tools and the right environment. Your understanding, you need to know the steps involved and how to do those steps in order to achieve the movement that you want. You need the strength enough for long enough. So you need the muscle to both be strong enough and to be able to endure the usage. You need flexibility, which is the range of movement in your joints. You need your timing to being able to move at the right time and in the right order, and not too late, not too early. Balance is an important part of this. So it goes back to, and the information from the senses, those things both go together. So this is clearly related to our sensory experience as well. So movement and sensory are very much tied together. So everything after motivation can improve with time and practice. We can even improve our balance. We can improve our proprioception, with different strategies. But the most important thing, the thing that always comes first, is motivation. So here's an example from daily life, drinking from a glass. And we would think that this is a fairly simple thing, right? But look at all that goes into it. So motivation first, well, you must have the desire for it. So you must feel thirsty, and you need to have a glass or a bottle, and you need to have water. You need to know all the steps and the order of them in order to get water into the glass, and then the glass. So I need to know that I have to put water in the glass first. I have to do that in a way that lines up the water to the glass so it doesn't get spilled everywhere, so that the water is actually getting in the glass. I need to know how to get the glass from the table to my mouth, and I need to know how to make my mouth move in order to let the water go in. I need to know all of those things. I need the strength to lift and move the glass and set it back down without crushing it or slamming it or any of those things. I need the flexibility to be able to open my hand and get it around the glass without knocking it over, and to close it again while holding it. I need the timing to be able to open my hand and to close it around the glass at the right time, not too late, not too early. I need the balance to be able to adjust my grip to keep the glass upright. I need to know which way is up. And I need to be taking in the information from my senses, like, is it cold? Is it heavy? Is it near enough to start drinking? Is there water going down my face? All of those things need to line up. So that is a quick daily example before I get kind of into more of the nitty gritty here. So motor learning is a complex process that occurs in the brain in response to practice or experience of a certain skill, resulting in changes in the central nervous system, which allows for the production of a new motor skill. And this process starts before birth. We're working on this when we're in the womb, and it continues to develop through adulthood. There's no end point to where we can develop a motor skill. We can keep learning our whole lives. There is this model of the stages of learning, and I'm going to talk about this now because this kind of goes into how we can then, if we can understand this, then we can support, put in the right support strategies for developing that motor skill. The Fitz and Posner model of motor learning states there are 3 stages: cognitive, associative, and autonomous. And cognitive is the novice stage, where we're brand new at it. And when we're brand new at a skill, it requires our full attention. We have to think about every step of what we're doing. We have to probably get support from somebody to help us learn how to do it. And if you think about toddlers learning how to eat and all of that, we're constantly helping newborns all the way through learning these different day-to-day life skills, as we call them, for being able to do toileting on their own. All of these things, it takes a lot of instruction and practice before they're able to be completed on their own. You will see rapid improvements while learning these basic skills, and that can be very motivating, but it's also inconsistent in performance, which can then be frustrating. So it requires supporting in that initial cognitive stage, or it requires outside support to encourage a young person to keep going. At the intermediate stage, when we're under optimum conditions, the skill will be achieved independently and we don't need support for that. But if any of those conditions change, then the performance might change. And smaller improvements might be needed and identified to be corrected, but you've kind of got the basics down and now you're just kind of working on perfection. When we get to the autonomous stage, the expert stage, this means that the achievement can happen under any condition. So whether the ground is rough or flat, or astroturf or grass, you're going to know how to walk across it. So that's the expert level of being able to achieve a motor skill. Your technique is still being fine-tuned, but your performance is consistent all of the time in how you're able to achieve that skill. Motor planning is the first step of being able to learn that new skill. It's one part of what's called praxis. Praxis is the ability to conceptualize, plan, organize, and execute a new action. And praxis involves 4 steps. Ideation, so coming up with the idea, not copying an idea, coming up with an idea on your own. Motor planning, so organizing and planning the idea, including knowing when and how to move the body. So I have the idea that I want to walk over there. I need to figure out what I need to do. I need to plan in order to be able to get over there. And then I need to do it. So that's the execution, it's performing the idea. And then feedback and adaptation, which is reviewing how that went, how I was able to achieve it, trying to figure out what I could have done better, and then implementing those changes and trying again. And sensory processing is integral to praxis because that's how we're able to determine what went well and what didn't. So this looks there's a lot of information here, and I'm not going to read all of it because you can spend time once you get the slides and look at it kind of more in detail and take your time to think about it. But the idea here is that, just like I said, those 4 steps of practice, we plan, we do, we evaluate, and then we repeat and try any changes to it. And that's how we learn that motor skill. Plan, do, evaluate, repeat. Plan, do, evaluate, repeat. The planning stage is about positioning your body to meet the demands of the task. So that's why we're saying, I have the idea that I'm going to walk. What do I need to be able to do that? I'm going to plan. The doing is the trying it out. So this comes under very specific kind of categories there. So eating, speaking, self-care, hand skills, and functional skills. And that's using your whole body to perform a task. Evaluation, and then how did that go? And then repeating it, trying out new things, and importantly, having the endurance and the motivation to keep going. So this in the repeat stage, this is where some young people can fall off because it didn't go the way they wanted, and they're not feeling capable of doing it. And we need to be there to help them stay motivated to try it again and refine that skill and learn the best way to do it for them. So the observable behavior related to these motor skills. So under plan, this one is very detailed. I'm sure you can see there's a lot of information there, but that's because in terms of what we're talking about for the profile wheel, I wanted you to have some examples of the kind of behavior you might be seeing and how you would then capture that in the form, in the tool. So under planning, that can be looking confused about where to start or needing prompts to gather the right equipment, even though they've done it a number of times before, needing to go to a quiet space to work out a plan, so not being able to do that first part of planning when other people are around, duplicating steps, and so or getting those steps out of order, not being able to line up their body with a ball to kick it, for example, or knowing how far to stretch their arm to hit a ball with a racket, or, where to position themselves to try to catch a ball, consistently missing their arm of their coat when trying to put a coat on, like just not being able to figure out what they have to do in order to change that, bumping into walls when trying to walk through a door or walking into anything in a room. So not being able to plan how to avoid collision, and not remembering the steps of tying shoes even after repeated practice. And I know tying shoes is one that particularly impacts many of the families that we work with. And then the do stage is maybe when they're eating, they're overfilling their mouth, or they're only putting really tiny amounts in, and so it takes a really long time to eat. Managing a task, but it looks awkward when compared to their peers, or not managing a task at all that would be expected of their age. Choking regularly, because remember, I said that part of the motor control that's involved in these skills is being able to eat and speak. That's using your tongue, using your swallowing muscles, all of those things. So if there's choking regularly, that could be they're maybe overfilling their mouth, they're maybe not chewing enough, or maybe their muscles aren't working as well as they could be. Challenges with modulating pressure, food falling out of your mouth regularly, slurring or unclear speech, tripping and falling more often than is typical for their age, using their hands to eat rather than cutlery, difficulty with sticking out their tongue, and support needed with toileting well beyond what would be expected of a normal kind of toileting age. Under evaluate, we have every attempt to do a task is completely different to the last attempt. So they're not really using anything that they learned from before and implementing that. They're just trying it in a completely different way. The same mistakes are made over and over without seeming to see the need to identify or being able to identify what needs to be changed. There's no discernible improvement in skills despite repeated practice. So they're doing it over and over, but it's still for some reason they're not embedding that skill. And being able to do a mastered task, being unable to do a mastered task if something has changed. So where I was saying you're at the expert level when any condition is still achievable. This would be if they can do it every single time that they're in your garden, for example, but they can't do it when they're on the playground at school, then we need to be looking at what the difference is there for them. And that could be the equipment, it could be the location, but as I said before, it could be the sensory experience, because sensory input is very important to our motor skills. And then the repeating, getting tired very easily, or getting sore very easily, getting sore in a way that seems excessive for the amount of activity that's been undertaken, giving up on a task, being completely exhausted after school, needing to take multiple breaks when out on a walk. So even if it's not a very long walk, but if there's that kind of repeated expression that that's just too much, I need to sit for a minute. Unable to practice a skill in different situations, and avoiding sports or physical activities altogether because of knowing that it's probably not going to go the way you want it to. And then this is the important part for this one, is the poor self-esteem that can become evident when involved in motor tasks. And that's when we want to be stepping in to prevent that, because the whole goal of what we're doing here is to try to help a young person engage with their world more confidently and happily. So we need to try to understand what's going on here so that we can address that and help them feel better about themselves. So this is the profile wheel, and all of that stuff that I've been talking about, this is what you would kind of capture in here. There are examples there highlighted in yellow, but really the idea is if you can see something and it can relate to gross motor skills or fine motor skills, put it there and capture it as evidence that can then be further interrogated to try to understand what the young person needs. So what can help motor skill development? Well, always neurodiversity affirming practice. After we have asked for the the young person's voice after we have asked them what they want and what they need, particularly if we're worried about self-esteem or self-worth. We want to be saying to them, is this something that you want to be able to do? Do you want to be able to kick a ball? Because if you don't, we don't need to work on that skill, right? It needs to be about what they want and what they need. And then we put into practice things that are strategies that are affirming of their experience and that help them develop their strengths. So I've put here kind of under the same colors of the plan, do, evaluate, repeat, suggestions for activities or strategies that can help. But you'll see that in the middle there, I've highlighted in yellow, check with your GP for any medical causes of difficulties. That has to happen first, because like I was saying with the choking, if there's a problem with the swallowing muscles, that could be a medical thing. We want to get that investigated. If somebody is complaining that their legs hurt all the time after doing even just minor activity, we need to check that with the GP first. It could be motor skill related, but we need to rule out any medical situations first. Okay, so for under planning, we can use visual aids, as we've talked about in a number of the other presentations. Visual aids can be very useful for making things tangible and for showing them the steps so that they're not having to try to remember it all in their head. And then once they've embedded that skill in it and they've become expert at it, then probably won't need the visual aid because it will then become kind of muscle memory. Break down tasks into more manageable steps, because as we saw with drinking the glass, you would think that's a fairly simple thing, but actually there's a whole lot that goes into it. So maybe we can break it down a little bit to make it more manageable for the planning stage. We can encourage recognizing and being connected with all the senses of the body. So that body awareness that we talked about in relation to our senses, the proprioception and importantly, the interoception. What is our body telling us, and how do I plan in order to meet what my body needs? Support planning practice in a variety of contexts so that you're getting that different experience in different areas to help build you up to that expert level. Provide really clear instructions, and that means really clear for the person who is receiving them. So be thinking about what you have noticed has worked before for that young person in terms of how explicit the instructions are that you're giving. We can use body doubling, which is having somebody who's doing the same thing alongside them so that you're kind of, they can be modeling, but also you can be sharing kind of the burden of the planning, if that makes sense. And very specific activities include doing things like obstacle courses, doing the climbing frame, playing Simon Says, and other games that require copying a movement, ladder walking on the ground, following treasure maps. There's loads of examples, and I have put links for those at the end of the presentation so that you can follow the links to find different activities that you can do that help with planning. Around doing, we want to target specific muscle movement to develop oral motor skills, and that can be activities that you do at home. It can just be practicing, like I said before, sticking out your tongue, playing games like that. Practice our cutlery skills out with meal times in fun ways. So when there's the pressure of both being hungry and knowing that your motor skills aren't that good, it's probably not the best time to try to teach somebody how to use a fork and a knife. It's better to be trying to do that stuff in play-oriented ways when there isn't additional pressure on the young person. You can replace standard shoelaces with elastic, and that's what we've done in my house because it just isn't worth the stress of trying to tie shoes, let me tell you. We have great options available to us now. We're very lucky to live in an age that has lots of adaptations kind of built in to things like that. So elastic laces, zip-up shoes, all of that. Practice wiping skills when not on the toilet, because again, there's pressure there, and there's also the sensory discomfort of all of the things that go with being on the toilet. So it's probably better to practice wiping skills and things like that when you're in a safer, more stable place. Specific activities include blowing bubbles together, playing pickup stick games, because that's going to practice your fine motor skills, doing jigsaw puzzles, threading games, things like that. Under evaluate, we're going to take the time to walk through evaluation together. So again, this kind of goes with the explicit instructions that we're giving. We might think that it should be obvious, or that this was fairly clear why this failed, but let's talk through it, and let's talk through it in an affirming way. Use wondering language to prompt the child to work out the solution so that they have ownership over that and to adapt their performance. So I wonder what would happen if you keep your fingers closed a little bit longer, right? Like, to try to help them come to the conclusion and to see that it's okay to be asking those kinds of questions. Like, that's part of the process. And then again, make things as tangible as possible. And then repeat, provide opportunities to rest at regular intervals, break down tasks into manageable chunks again, needing to take breaks, take multiple breaks when out on a walk. So just let them do that. Encourage managing different variables through practice in differing contexts, and celebrate with them when they achieve a goal. That's their goal. So a little bit more related to this. So I've kept the colors there so you can see kind of the stages at which they happen. It's important to have these steps in order to support a young person to be able to develop their own motor skills. We need to be conscious of these areas. We need to be, the goals are about the motivation, the environment, that kind of goes into our sensory experiences and all of these things. But it's important to note that those goals should be what the child wants. So we want to have specific goals so that we can focus what we're doing. But again, the child needs to have the motivation. So that goal needs to be theirs. They need to be able to want to do something in order for them to be able to get through the rest of it, because it's actually really difficult and really frustrating and really demoralizing a lot of the time to try to learn a new skill when you're just not good at it. And so we also want to be selective. There are probably lots of things that a child is going to want to do, but what is it that matters right now to that child? Because the long-term goal may be, being able to do the really high rope thing at Landmark. But there's some skills that we need to develop before we can get to that. So let's focus on the right now and prioritize that, so that the child is also experiencing success earlier and feeling more positive about themselves, to that self-esteem element that we were talking about. We want to be realistic and set the level by ability, not by age, in order to determine the time frame that we're going to be working to. And we need to be systematic. We need to break it down into steps. And the best way to do this can be to do it yourself before working on it with the child. So really being very explicit with yourself. If I want to pick up the glass, what does that entail? Let me note down every single step. And we also need to be adaptable. So we want to be able to review our goals regularly, to acknowledge progress and change things if needed, because maybe partway through you've realized you're doing the tying shoes thing, and partway through you realize he doesn't actually need this. Let's work on something else, because as we talked about before, we have fluctuating capacity. We have all of these demands upon us. What is the area that we actually need to spend our energy on? Is it on this task? Because a lot of the time we're doing things because we think we're supposed to be doing them. It doesn't mean that we should be doing them. Okay. Practice and praise kind of comes under do. And I want to, the reason I have praise in quotes is because there's a lot of work that's been done by people like Alfie Kohn, who talk about the dangers of reward and punishment systems, or praise as a motivator. Meaningless praise is not a motivator, because what they're not then trying to achieve the task for the innate sense of achievement in having completed that task. They're trying to complete it because they want you to be nice to them. So praise is very specific here that I'm talking about it. So we're going to, in terms of the practice, we're going to give just a few instructions at a time. We're going to reduce the input so that they can practice the thing that we're talking about right now and make sure that they're getting that part down before we move on to something else. We're going to use the plan, do, evaluate cycle to identify the areas for change in order to improve a skill, but also to get experience in trying that, and then add that to the wealth of knowledge that the young person has. We're going to use repetition, and the best way to use repetition is to use daily life opportunities to work on these skills. So not necessarily in the specific context, but in other areas that can also be working on that same thing. So if we're working on fine motor skills, if we're working on trying to be able to thread a needle, or there's lots of threading games and things you can do. Well, we can be doing that by maybe picking up stuff off the floor just one at a time. There was a thing that I did with my youngest son, which was picking up rice granules to really help him kind of refine that movement. So putting rice in a tray and having him pick it up and put it into a cup. And that was play for him. He was doing that through kind of like a play mindset, but it also helped him work on that skill in a way that then didn't feel like it was a punishment or a chore. Practice alongside rather than mirror image, because if the skill is difficult to do on its own, just imagine trying to copy somebody who's doing it in the opposite way from you. So we're going to sit alongside and do it together as opposed to facing each other. Use backward chaining. We haven't talked a lot about backward chaining so far, but I can talk more about that in the question and answer section if you want more information. Backward chaining is a great technique for allowing somebody to experience success rather than endless frustration in completing a task. So if we're working on zipping up a coat, we maybe help them line it up and pull it up most of the way, but then we let them finish it all the way to the top so that they can say they finished zipping up their coat, and then work back to the next step and let them do the last two steps and so on. Varied practice once basics are learned, and that's to get them used to different conditions and environments. And then here's the praise that we're going to talk about. So we're going to acknowledge what they've achieved with specificity to validate what aspects worked well. And that's saying things like, I could see how you spent a lot of time lining up the bottom of the coat, the zipper, to get it in, and then we're able to pull it up. And that was really great, the way that you were able to do that. So we're going to be very specific about what we're praising there, so that they know we're not just generally praising them, but that they worked out a plan, they did it, and we're evaluating it with them. And then again, celebrate together when the child achieves their goals, and all the mini goals along the way, so that we're building up that self-esteem. Environment comes under evaluate, because if things have not gone necessarily as well as you would like, then we want to be looking at what are the things that have possibly changed, or what has made it difficult this time. Is there a distraction? Is there something that's too bright, or it's too loud? And we can reduce those distractions for the next time. Were they starting up too high when they were trying to learn how to jump? Like, can I change that environment to make it a little bit lower? Have a stable, if we have a stable starting base closer to the ground, or that our shoes aren't the ones on wheels, for example, or if we're looking at the kind of chair that it is, if it's not a funky chair, but like just a normal four-legged chair or lower to the ground, any of those things, do we have a stable starting base? We want to be comfy, because if we're not comfy, again, that with the sensory things, that can be impacting how our motor skills are working. So we want to be doing things at a time, as I said before, that are not already pressure points, not when the child's hungry, not when they're overtired because it's the end of the school day. Showing them how to set the right amount of space is an important part of that. So when they're not cramped in, that's not when we're going to try to work on a motor skill. And then use the environment to help with the planning. So we can be evaluating, I didn't know where my helmet was. How could I know better to put on my helmet? And we can say, well, let's put a hook for the helmet right next to the bike, right? So then we're looking at the environment around it and using it to help us remove some of the pressure from that planning part of it in the beginning. You can put tape on a racket to mark the correct positioning if they can't remember where to hold it, or have a dedicated space for homework that has all of the items already there, so they're not having to try to remember to gather all of the equipment that they're going to need. And then adaptations, I have a whole slide for that, so I'm going to talk about that more on the next slide. But basically, our adaptations under the repeat part are about ensuring that the overall aim is being achieved. So it can get complicated, but this is why we want to be specific at the beginning. What is our specific goal that we're working on, and are we able to achieve that? And again, all of our supports should always be affirming of the internal experience. So any adaptations that could be beneficial will be determined by asking a number of questions. So what is the specific goal? What is the aim? If it's a specific motor skill problem, do we need to be trying to manage that in the way that we're doing it, or is another way possible? So if the skill in this example is completing a homework task, the completing of the homework task doesn't necessarily mean it has to be handwritten if that's not a requirement. So let's look at what the requirements are. If it matters that the task is completed, well, then maybe we can do it on a Chromebook, or maybe we can do it with magnetic letters, or maybe we can do it on a whiteboard or something. Handwriting with a pen on paper isn't always the easiest or the best way for a young person to demonstrate the knowledge that they have or the understanding that they have. So if we want to look at what the goal is, and then kind of problem solve around the ways that we can get that goal achieved. Can the posture be changed to make it easier? So for example, you might have a really, like, maybe a beanbaggy chair, and that is not helping them with getting their handwriting where they want it to be. And what they're wanting to work on is that their handwriting is clear, if that's their goal. So then we say, well, maybe a straighter back chair would help with that. If you're sitting more upright, it might help you to hold your arm in a better way. Or if we're wanting to learn to jump, we can start lower to the ground. So start with bended knees, and then when we bounce up, it'll be a bigger jump, and then we're getting that experience without feeling unstable, because maybe the problem with jumping is that they feel anxious when their feet aren't touching the ground, Can the whole task be made easier by removing steps entirely? So for example, buttons. I know buttons are a big thing for lots of our young people. And that small top button on the top of a shirt, a shirt collar, I think they invented in order to make our lives difficult. So if the smallest top button on a shirt is the hardest to do, because it is, and they're getting all of the other buttons just fine, maybe we just remove that as a step. We can maybe just not button it altogether, or maybe use Velcro to allow the whole task to be achieved. Both of my children are of the opinion that if there's a button there, it's meant to be done. And so we have developed a process of kind of body doubling, or I guess supported independence, where they do all the other buttons and I always do the top one for them, because then they know that it's done. And that just ends that task for them. And this is kind of that co-regulation thing I've talked about a lot of the time. What matters to them is that the top button is done, and then they're ready to do their day. It doesn't really impact me or hurt me in order to do that last button, and they feel like they've achieved something, and we've gotten there in a way that is positive for them. So that's a win-win in my book. So you can be looking at how you can adapt a task in order to make it work for everybody. There's no only one right way to do something. Can the equipment or tools be changed to facilitate learning? And this is I think really important in terms of kind of that sensory and affirming mindset. So just because most people are okay with using a thin pen, it doesn't mean that that's the right way to do it. So maybe use a wider pen if that's what helps you. You can get pencils that have grips on them, and that can absolutely help with letter formation and grip and putting your fingers in the right place. And also not gripping too tight, because I don't know if you've ever noticed your young person, their hand being really, really sore after writing just a very little amount. That's because their grip is too tight, or they're very possibly holding it in the wrong place and having to hold it tighter in order to keep it upright in order to write. So we can help that by changing the tools. A bigger ball is easier to catch. So why are we practicing? Why are we starting at our novice stage of learning with a baseball? Let's start with like a big inflatable ball. Lowering the bike saddle when riding on the bike can make that feel more stable. So, have it lower if that's what works for them. The easy tie laces we've talked about, using a bowl instead of a plate if eating is kind of messy. So keeping it on a plate is difficult. So why are we using a plate? Let's use a bowl. And then, of course, special cutlery. And can the tools that are being used be adapted? So change out a screw top bottle for a flip top. Put a small tear in a snack bag ahead of time so that when they're at school, they can open their snack on their own. And that's kind of like backward chaining a little bit. You're giving them the success of completing the task, and they're feeling independent and positive about themselves, and also able to manage when they get food for themselves. So that's important. And there are specialized pencil grips that you can get to make it less tiring to write. There are things that you can actually put on pencils that show kids where to hold their fingers, which is really positive. Okay, so our key takeaways. We need motor skills to be able to direct our body to achieve a task. Gross motor skills use big body movements. Fine motor skills use precise body movements. There are 4 steps to learning a new motor skill: plan, do, evaluate, repeat. Motivation is the most important aspect of learning a new motor skill. Motor learning is a lifelong process. And I didn't say before, but I'll say it now. It's also not innate. It is learned. So this is something we have to work at. And then how do we work at that? We practice. And remembering that we can support young people to develop their motor skills through using that goals, practice, environment, adaptation approach. And then, just as a reminder, because we're talking about this in relation to the wheel, the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel, we're using this to gain perspective on their internal experience, to get their voice on what they want, what they need. This is not to force them to comply with the predominant neurotype norms. We're not going to say to a young person, you absolutely have to learn to tie your shoes because everybody learns to tie your shoes. That might be more harmful than it is helpful if they've got a number of other pressures on them. So we're not using this to try to say these are the areas where you're not doing the right things. We're using it to say, I can see what you're going through, and I'm going to try to come up with ways to make it easier. So if you have any questions or you need any additional support, you can contact Thriving Families. And of course, you can always call Just Ask on Tuesdays to Thursdays. If you're wanting specifically to know about fine motor skills or gross motor skills, you can ask to speak with either OT or with physical therapy. I think there's a pediatric physical therapist, but they can maybe give you some ideas. And if you're concerned about any of these being medical issues, always go to your GP and talk about it with them first. And I wanted to show you the resources. So here are the resources and the links. These are some local resources there, and then activities and information that are available that I found. And then there are specific links here that when you get this information in the handout that I send out, all these links will be active and you can just go through and use them. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week for social.